The night was calm. Street lamps glowed a dull amber across the cul-de-sac, casting long shadows on manicured lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges. Inside his living room, Anthony sat in his recliner, half listening to the old jazz records spinning on his turntable. He had spent decades in the army, and silence was now his favorite kind of music. But this night wasn't going to stay silent for long. At first, he thought it was nothing, maybe the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the siding. But then it came again, the rattle of a doorknob. Sharp. Intentional. Someone was trying to open his front door. Anthony froze. His instincts, sharpened by years of deployments, kicked in immediately. He rose, moving toward the foyer with deliberate steps. His hand hovered near the baseball bat he kept by the umbrella stand, not out of fear, but out of habit. Another rattle. Louder this time. Whoever it was wasn't just jiggling the knob, they were testing it, twisting it, forcing it like they had every right to enter. Anthony unlocked the deadbolt from the inside and swung the door open. There she was. Lorraine. The self-appointed queen of the HOA, the one neighbor who never knocked, only demanded. Her blonde bob was stiff with hairspray, her pearl necklace glinting in the porch light. But what struck Anthony most was the look on her face, pure confusion, as if she had just seen a ghost. "Lorraine," Anthony said, voice calm but firm. "Why are you touching my door?" Her eyes flickered, scanning him up and down. "What are you doing here?" she blurted, like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Anthony tilted his head. "I live here." "No," she snapped, shaking her head furiously. "This house isn't yours. My key isn't working. That's my proof. You," she pointed at him with trembling fingers, "you must have broken in." Anthony let out a dry laugh. Not the amused kind, the kind that came when a situation was so absurd, you couldn't decide if it was comedy or tragedy. "I've owned this house for months, Lorraine. My deed's in the drawer, if you'd like to see it. Maybe your key doesn't work because," he paused, locking eyes with her, "it was never yours to begin with." But Lorraine wasn't listening. She pulled her phone out, her face twisting into a scowl. "No. No, no, no. I won't be lied to. This neighborhood has rules. We can't just have strangers moving in, changing locks, doing whatever they please. I'm calling the police." Anthony crossed his arms, standing tall in the doorway. He didn't flinch, didn't try to stop her. He had faced worse threats than an HOA Karen with a phone in her hand. But something in his chest ached. This wasn't the first time Lorraine had treated him like an outsider. She had complained about his truck being parked on the street. She had left passive-aggressive notes about his lawn being too natural. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't just a neighbor with too much free time. Tonight, she was trying to turn him into a criminal. As she dialed, Anthony noticed movement from across the street. Curtains shifted. A porch light flicked on. The neighborhood was watching. People who had smiled at him during barbecues now stood in their living rooms, waiting to see what would happen. Anthony sighed. He had fought for this country, carried the weight of service on his shoulders. And yet, here he was, still forced to prove he belonged in his own home. Lorraine's voice broke the silence. She was already speaking to the 911 dispatcher, her tone frantic, exaggerated. "Yes, hello. There's a dangerous man inside my house. I tried to get in, but he won't leave. He's refusing to show proof. Please hurry, this is an emergency." Anthony clenched his jaw but stayed calm. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing fear. He leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, watching her dig her own grave with every word. The jazz record inside kept spinning, a low trumpet note humming through the air, as if mocking the absurdity of the moment. And Anthony thought to himself, here we go again. Because he knew, the flashing red and blue lights weren't far away. And whatever happened next, would change everything. Lorraine lowered her phone slowly, ending the 911 call with a dramatic sigh, as if she had just saved the entire neighborhood from an intruder. Her eyes gleamed with triumph. Anthony, still standing in his doorway, didn't move. He simply studied her. Years of discipline had taught him patience, but he also knew what was coming. He could already hear the faint echo of sirens in the distance, growing louder with every second. "You'll regret this," Lorraine said, straightening her pearl necklace like armor. "The police don't take kindly to squatters. And when they get here, they'll drag you out of here in handcuffs. Then maybe this neighborhood will be safe again." Anthony let out a breath, slow and measured. "Safe," he repeated. "Lorraine, I served 25 years in the U.S. Army. I've lived here for months. My name is on every bill, every tax statement. You know that. So tell me, what's so unsafe about me?" Her lips tightened into a thin line. She didn't answer, because the answer wasn't about paperwork or safety. It was about control. About power. But instead of admitting it, Lorraine raised her voice, loud enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. "Everyone should know, this man broke into my home. He changed the locks and is refusing to leave." The crowd reacted like a wave. Murmurs rippled through the shadows. A man in a bathrobe whispered to his wife. A teenager pulled out his phone and started recording. Someone else muttered, "Is that true?" while another neighbor shook her head, eyes darting nervously between Anthony and Lorraine. Anthony felt the weight of their stares pressing against him, but he refused to shrink. He stepped onto his porch, his tall frame lit by the amber glow of the street lamp. "I own this house," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the lawn. "I've got nothing to hide. Anyone here who doubts me can look at the deed." Lorraine scoffed. "Oh, please. That's what they all say. I know a squatter when I see one." Her words dripped with venom. And though she didn't say it outright, everyone knew what she meant by they. Anthony's jaw tightened. He had been called many things during his years of service, but never once had he been treated as invisible in the country he swore to protect. Yet here, in his own neighborhood, a woman with an inflated sense of authority was trying to erase his right to exist in his own home. The sirens grew closer now, the faint wail cutting through the night air. Lorraine smiled, not out of relief, but out of confidence. She believed justice was on her side. "You hear that?" she said, tilting her head toward the sound. "They'll be here any second. And then we'll see who's telling the truth." Anthony didn't flinch. He leaned back against the porch railing, folding his arms, as though he were simply waiting for an old friend. His calmness only seemed to fuel Lorraine's anger. "You think you can intimidate me with your silence?" she hissed. "Well, you can't. This neighborhood follows the rules. And people like you don't just get to move in without permission. Not under my watch." Anthony finally smiled, a small, weary smile. "Lorraine," he said softly, "you don't have the power you think you do. And when those officers step out of their car, you're going to learn that the hard way." The crowd stirred again, some siding with Lorraine, others glancing uneasily at Anthony, their loyalties split. The teenager's camera phone stayed fixed on both of them, capturing every second. The sirens were close now. Just around the corner. Red and blue lights flickered faintly against the houses at the far end of the street. Lorraine straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and clutched her phone like a badge of honor. "This is it," she muttered. "Justice." Anthony, on the other hand, closed his eyes for just a moment, exhaling slowly. He wasn't worried. He knew something Lorraine didn't. Something that would turn this entire night upside down. The tires screeched as the patrol SUV swung into the cul-de-sac, headlights blazing, siren cutting off suddenly. Every neighbor fell silent. The stage was set. And the next move would change everything. The patrol SUV rolled to a stop at the curb, tires crunching against the gravel. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Porch lights flicked on up and down the street, illuminating rows of anxious faces. A dozen neighbors now stood scattered across driveways and lawns, their whispers replaced by silence. Anthony stayed still on his porch, tall and steady. Lorraine, however, rushed forward like she had been waiting for this moment all her life. She waved frantically at the SUV, pearls bouncing against her collarbone. "Officers! Over here!" she shouted, her voice shrill with triumph. "That's him! That's the intruder!" The driver's door opened, and a deputy stepped out, bathed in the flashing red and blue. His uniform was crisp, his movements confident. He rested a hand on the radio strapped to his shoulder as he scanned the scene. His gaze landed first on Lorraine, loud, frantic, pointing. Then his eyes shifted to Anthony, calm, unshaken, standing in his doorway as if he owned the whole block. Two more deputies emerged from the SUV, hands near their holsters, eyes alert. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Lorraine wasted no time. She marched toward the lead deputy, her voice rising so the whole cul-de-sac could hear. "That man broke into my house," she declared, stabbing a finger toward Anthony. "I tried to get inside, but my key wouldn't work. He locked me out, and now he's refusing to leave. He's dangerous. You need to get him out of here before he hurts someone." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the watching neighbors. A few nodded along with her, uneasy. Others looked skeptical, eyes flicking between Anthony's composed stance and Lorraine's frantic theatrics. Anthony didn't budge. His voice, when it finally came, was calm and low. "Deputies," he said, "my name is Anthony Harris. I live here. I have the deed, the keys, the bills. This woman is trespassing on my property." Lorraine spun around, her face flushed red. "He's lying. Don't listen to him. He doesn't belong here. She stopped herself, but everyone knew what word had almost slipped past her lips. The lead deputy raised a hand, silencing both sides for a moment. His expression was unreadable. He studied Anthony carefully, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. Something flickered across his face, recognition. But Lorraine, blinded by her own performance, didn't notice. She kept pressing forward. "Why are you hesitating? Arrest him. Look at him. He's not supposed to be here." The deputy didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his head toward the crowd, scanning the neighbors who stood frozen in their yards. Some avoided his gaze. Others shifted uncomfortably, as though they had been caught participating in a play they weren't proud of. Anthony didn't move. He let the silence stretch. He knew the truth didn't need to be shouted. It only needed to be revealed. Lorraine stomped her foot, nearly shrieking now. "Do your job. Put him in cuffs already." And then, it happened. The deputy finally stepped forward. His boots hit the pavement in steady, deliberate thuds as he approached the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, staring directly up at Anthony. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath again. And then, in a voice that carried across the entire cul-de-sac, he said just two words. "Hey, Dad." The silence shattered. Gasps erupted from the crowd. A woman in the back clapped her hand over her mouth. The teenager with the phone whispered, "No way." Lorraine's face drained of color so fast she looked like a ghost. Anthony's lips curled into the faintest smile. Calm. Unbothered. Vindicated. Lorraine staggered backward, stammering. "Dad? What do you mean, Dad? He can't be your..." But the deputy ignored her, climbing the porch steps to stand beside his father. He placed a hand gently on Anthony's shoulder, his eyes scanning the crowd now. Authority radiated from him, not just the kind sewn into a badge, but the kind earned through loyalty, family, and truth. The power dynamic shifted in an instant. And for the first time that night, Lorraine realized this wasn't her neighborhood to control anymore. The air hung heavy after that single word. "Dad." The crowd rippled with shock. A neighbor actually dropped his coffee mug onto the driveway, porcelain shattering against the concrete. The teenager recording whispered, "This is insane," as his camera zoomed in, capturing every second for the world to see. Anthony remained still, his calm demeanor unchanged, though the faint smile tugging at his lips betrayed the satisfaction in his chest. For years, men like him had been forced to defend their place, to prove their worth, to fight battles they shouldn't have to fight. Tonight, he didn't need to raise his voice. His son's presence spoke louder than anything he could have said. Lorraine blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Wait, what?" That's your father," she stammered, her voice climbing higher with each word. No, this can't be right. You're supposed to protect me. Not him." The deputy didn't flinch. He kept his hand on Anthony's shoulder, steady as a rock. "Protecting people means protecting the truth," he said firmly. Then he turned his gaze on Lorraine, his expression sharpening. "And the truth is, this is his house. He's the rightful owner. And you just filed a false emergency report." Murmurs rolled through the cul-de-sac like thunder. Some neighbors nodded silently, relief crossing their faces as if they had been waiting for someone to finally say it. Others looked guilty, suddenly fascinated with their own lawns, unwilling to meet Anthony's eyes. Lorraine shook her head wildly, clinging to her story. "No, you don't understand. My key wouldn't work. That proves he changed the locks. He tricked everyone. Your key doesn't work because it was never your house to begin with," the deputy cut in, his tone clipped. He pulled out the rugged tablet mounted to his duty belt, swiping quickly through property records. In seconds, Anthony's name and ownership details glowed across the screen. Records show Anthony Harris bought this property 6 months ago. Mortgage, utilities, taxes. All current. All his. The neighbors leaned in, catching glimpses of the proof. Lorraine's face turned scarlet. You don't understand," she stammered again, her voice cracking. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. That's my job as HOA chair." Anthony finally spoke, his voice deep and unshaken. "No, Lorraine. Your job is to enforce community standards, not to decide who belongs and who doesn't. You crossed a line tonight." The deputy's jaw tightened. "False reports waste resources and put lives at risk. If my officers had believed your call at face value, things could have ended very differently." His eyes flicked toward his father, a shadow of what-ifs crossing his face. Dangerously differently. Lorraine's composure collapsed. She looked around desperately for support, but the neighbors she once commanded with fear and rules now avoided her gaze. The same people who nodded along to her complaints about lawns and paint colors now whispered about lawsuits, shame, and the embarrassment of being wrong, so publicly. She took a step back. I didn't mean any harm. It was just a misunderstanding." "No," Anthony interrupted, his voice low but firm. "You meant exactly what you said. You looked me in the eye and decided I didn't belong in my own home. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a choice." The silence that followed was heavier than the sirens had been. The deputy turned to his fellow officers. "We'll file this as a false report. Write it up." The other deputies nodded, already pulling out their notepads. Lorraine gasped, her eyes wide, but no words came this time. Anthony exhaled, the tension finally releasing from his shoulders. He glanced at his son, pride flickering in his eyes. This was the justice Lorraine hadn't expected, justice not in her favor, but in truth's favor. The neighborhood watched, forever changed. Because the night Lorraine tried to paint Anthony as an outsider was the night the truth revealed he belonged more than she ever did. The night didn't return to normal. It couldn't. Even after the deputies finished their report and the flashing lights dimmed, the neighborhood still buzzed with a different kind of electricity. Word traveled faster than the sirens had, a current of whispers, text messages, and group chats lighting up phones across the subdivision. By the time the patrol SUV pulled away, everyone knew the story. Lorraine, the almighty HOA chair, had called 911 on Anthony, only to discover that his son was the deputy who responded. Lorraine tried to leave quietly, slipping back toward her house with her shoulders hunched and her head down. But the eyes of the neighborhood followed her every step. No one greeted her. No one defended her. The same neighbors who once clung to her every word now stared in silence, their loyalty cracked like glass. Anthony stayed on his porch, arms folded across his chest. He wasn't smiling, but there was a steady strength in his posture. For months, he had endured Lorraine's endless complaints and thinly veiled hostility. Tonight, though, he hadn't needed to raise his voice, hadn't needed to argue. The truth, and his son's badge, had spoken for him. Across the street, a man in a robe cleared his throat. "Anthony," he called softly, "if you ever need a witness." "I saw everything." Another neighbor, one who had always avoided eye contact, stepped forward. She went too far tonight. We all know it." Her voice trembled, but it was brave enough to break the silence. Lorraine froze mid-step, spinning back around. "Oh, don't act like you're innocent," she snapped, her voice sharp with desperation. "You've all complained about him too." "I was just saying what everyone was thinking." But no one agreed. No one nodded. The crowd's silence cut deeper than any shouted rejection could. Anthony finally spoke, his voice steady as stone. "You were never protecting this neighborhood, Lorraine. You were protecting your control. And that ends tonight." Her mouth opened, ready to fire back, but no words came. Her authority had crumbled in front of everyone, not because Anthony shouted her down, but because the community had seen her exposed. The teenager who had filmed the entire incident slipped back into the crowd, his phone still recording. Within minutes, that video would be posted online, shared, dissected, and replayed across platforms. Lorraine had lived for power in this subdivision, but now her name was about to be trending for all the wrong reasons. Anthony's son, the deputy, lingered a little longer, his presence like a shield. "Dad," he said quietly, "call me if she bothers you again. The department takes false reports seriously. She won't get away with this twice." Anthony nodded, pride swelling in his chest. Not for the authority of the badge, but for the man his son had become. Lorraine stormed off at last, muttering under her breath, fumbling with her keys as she disappeared into her house. Her front door slammed, but the sound didn't carry power anymore. It carried defeat. One by one, the neighbors began retreating too, but not before giving Anthony small nods, glances of respect they had never shown before. Some were guilty, realizing they had stood by too long. Others were relieved, knowing the reign of the HOA queen was cracking. Anthony finally stepped back inside, closing his own door with a quiet finality. The jazz record was still spinning, the low trumpet humming the same tune it had played before all the chaos. But now it sounded different. Brighter. Victorious. Because tonight, Anthony hadn't just defended his home. He had exposed the truth. And the power Lorraine had wielded for so long? It had vanished in the blink of flashing red and blue lights. The HOA clubhouse had never been this full. Every chair was taken, neighbors lined the walls, and the air carried that heavy quiet before a storm. At the front, Lorraine sat stiffly behind the long folding table, her gavel resting just inches from her hand. She wore her favorite blazer, the one she always put on when she wanted to project authority. But tonight, it looked more like armor that couldn't hide the cracks. She cleared her throat. "I want to begin," she said, her voice tight, "by addressing the incident. A misunderstanding. A simple miscommunication, really." The room shifted, some people glanced down at their phones, others exchanged skeptical looks. "A misunderstanding," a man near the back repeated. "You called 911 because you couldn't open someone else's door." Lorraine's jaw clenched. "I was acting in the interest of the neighborhood. I believed there was a trespasser. I was trying to keep us safe." Murmurs rippled through the room. For once, no one nodded along. Anthony sat calmly in the front row, arms folded, his son seated beside him in uniform. The deputy's badge caught the fluorescent light, gleaming like undeniable truth. Anthony didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. He just let Lorraine talk and unravel. "Look," Lorraine tried again, her tone sharper now. This entire community knows Anthony has been difficult. Always questioning the rules, always. Always paying my dues on time, Anthony cut in, his voice steady but commanding. Always following the bylaws. The difference is, Lorraine, I don't bow to your power. Gasps and low chuckles rippled across the room. Lorraine slammed the gavel down. Crack! Out of order, she barked. But the gavel didn't silence anyone this time. The neighbors leaned forward instead, watching the balance shift. Anthony stood. Not angrily, not theatrically, but with quiet conviction. My son came here that night because you abused 911. You knew who lived in that house. You just didn't like it. His words landed heavy. No one moved. No one breathed. Anthony turned to the crowd. How many of you have been threatened with fines for leaving your trash cans out 10 minutes too long? How many have been written up for lawn care, for the wrong color blinds, for things that never mattered until Lorraine decided they did? Hands rose. Slowly at first, then more and more. Nearly the entire room lifted their arms. Lorraine's face drained of color. This isn't about safety, Anthony continued. It's about control. And it stops tonight. The room erupted, applause, cheers, a wave of voices rising in agreement. For the first time in years, the neighbors weren't afraid of Lorraine. They were united against her. She pounded the gavel again, but the sound was drowned out. Her power had slipped completely, right there in the clubhouse she once ruled like a throne room. Finally, the HOA secretary, a man who had always sat quietly at Lorraine's side, spoke up. His voice was steady, almost relieved. Effective immediately, he announced, we motion to hold a vote of no confidence in the chair. The cheers grew louder. Hands shot up around the room, faster than Lorraine could even count. Her own board had turned against her. Lorraine sputtered, You can't do this to me. After all I've done for this neighborhood. Anthony looked at her calmly. You did it to yourself. The vote was unanimous. When it was over, Lorraine didn't slam the gavel. She didn't even speak. She simply gathered her papers with trembling hands, her blazer no longer armor but just fabric, and walked out of the clubhouse without looking back. Anthony stayed standing, his son beside him, as neighbors clapped him on the back, offering thanks, apologies, and promises of change. For the first time, the community wasn't Lorraine's anymore. It belonged to everyone again. And Anthony, the man she had tried to cast out, had become the symbol of its strength. By morning, the neighborhood incident was no longer just neighborhood gossip. It was everywhere. The teenager who had filmed the whole confrontation had uploaded the video to TikTok overnight. Within hours, it exploded. The clip was barely 2 minutes long, Lorraine yanking on Anthony's door, shouting into her phone about a suspicious man, the sheriff's SUV pulling up, and then the deputy stepping out and saying the word that flipped the entire narrative, Dad? Millions of views poured in. Comments stacked by the thousands. HOA Karen caught in 4K. She really called the cops on the homeowner skull. That twist though, his son is the sheriff? Instant karma. By lunchtime, news outlets were reaching out. Local stations picked it up, then national ones. Lorraine's name wasn't trending just in the subdivision's group chat anymore, it was trending across the internet. Anthony hadn't even watched the full video until then. He sat at his kitchen table, coffee in hand, his phone buzzing non-stop with notifications. He scrolled through the comments, half amused, half overwhelmed. Some people were angry for him, others laughed at the absurdity, but almost everyone agreed on one thing: Lorraine had been exposed. Across the street, Lorraine's blinds stayed shut. Her driveway was empty. The once proud woman who marched the sidewalks like a self-appointed sheriff now hid behind her own curtains. Her phone wasn't quiet, though. It rang, buzzed, and lit up with texts from reporters, board members, even old friends telling her they didn't want to be involved. Emails poured in, too, HOA associations from across the state condemning her actions, people demanding her resignation, others mocking her mercilessly. By the third day, memes surfaced. A photo of Lorraine holding her gavel with the caption, "When you call 911 but the sheriff calls him Dad." Another showed a mansion door labeled private property, with a cartoon Lorraine tugging on the knob. She had wanted power. Now she had infamy. Anthony, meanwhile, noticed a change when he stepped outside. The neighbors who once looked away or whispered now greeted him openly. A man waved from his porch. A woman approached with a pie, muttering an apology for never speaking up before. Kids rode their bikes past his house, calling, "Hey, Mr. Anthony." For the first time since moving in, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like a cornerstone. His son stopped by again in uniform that weekend. Neighbors peeked from their windows, not in suspicion but in respect. Anthony clapped a hand on his son's shoulder. "Guess you're famous now too," he said with a small grin. The deputy chuckled. "Nah. You are. I just showed up and did my job. You're the one standing tall." That night, Anthony sat on his porch with a glass of sweet tea. The air was cooler, quieter, different. Across the way, Lorraine's house stayed dark, her once flourishing flower beds beginning to wilt without her daily fussing. Some said she was packing to leave the neighborhood. Others whispered she was staying but too ashamed to show her face. Either way, her reign was over. And Anthony? He didn't need revenge. He didn't need to see her suffer. All he needed was the peace of knowing the truth had come out, louder than Lorraine's voice, stronger than her gavel, undeniable as the word that broke her illusion of power. Dad. The internet had made sure that one moment would never be forgotten. And the man who once endured her shadow now lived freely in the sunlight, his home finally his own, respected, defended, and untouchable. A week after the HOA meeting, the subdivision felt different. Lighter. The clubhouse bulletin board, once plastered with Lorraine's fines and reminder notices, now displayed something new, a flyer announcing a special election for HOA chairperson. For the first time in years, neighbors weren't rolling their eyes or dreading another meeting. They were hopeful. Anthony walked past it on his way to collect his mail. People nodded, smiled, even stopped in to chat. A man who had never spoken more than a curt hello said, "Anthony, you should run for the board. We need someone like you." Anthony chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't move here to play politics. I just wanted peace." But even as he said it, he knew something had shifted. Peace wasn't just the absence of conflict, it was the presence of fairness. And fairness had to be protected. Across the street, Lorraine's house sat in silence. The blinds still closed, the garden now more weeds than roses. Rumor had it she'd resigned from the board completely, though she hadn't announced it herself. Her once daily patrols had vanished. So had the clipped, condescending emails she used to blast to the whole neighborhood. For Anthony, that absence was enough. He didn't need her apology. He didn't need her approval. He had won by standing firm, by letting the truth reveal itself in front of everyone. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the houses gold, Anthony's son stopped by again. This time, out of uniform. Just a son visiting his father. They sat together on the porch, listening to cicadas hum in the trees. "You know," his son said, "that night, when I saw her pulling on your door like she owned it, I thought about how many times I've responded to calls just like that. Calls where people looked at someone and assumed the worst. But this time was different. This time, it was you." Anthony nodded slowly. "And that's why it mattered, son. Because it wasn't just about me. It was about all the people who never had someone in uniform step out and say, 'That's my dad.'" The words settled heavy between them, but they weren't bitter. They were true. The neighborhood had learned something that night too. They had seen how silence, years of shrugging, of letting Lorraine run unchecked, had built her power. And they had also seen how quickly that power crumbled when one man refused to be silent anymore. A few days later, Anthony received a handwritten note in his mailbox. No signature, just careful cursive. Thank you for standing up. You gave us courage. We're sorry it took so long. Anthony read it twice, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his Bible. That weekend, the neighborhood gathered again. Not for an HOA showdown, but for a block barbecue. Kids ran laughing through sprinklers, the smell of burgers filled the air, and neighbors who had once barely spoken now shared stories over paper plates. Anthony stood among them, not as a target, not as an outsider, but as a neighbor. As part of the community he had always belonged to. He didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. His resilience had already written the story everyone now carried. And as the evening wound down, with fireflies blinking against the dusk, Anthony leaned back in his chair, watching his neighbors laugh, watching his son toss a football with the kids, watching his home glow in the fading light. Lorraine's shadow was gone. The fear she cast had dissolved. What remained was stronger, a community that had learned the cost of silence, and the power of standing with the truth. Anthony smiled softly, his words almost a whisper to the night. This is what home was always meant to be.